Okay, we are live. Give me 5 seconds to make sure that we're okay on Rumble as well. So I can click the live link on Rumble and we will get started. Rumble, Rockfin. Rockfin. Let me click that live on Rockfin. Okay, great. We're all good to go on Rockfin. We are looking good on Odyssey and on Rumble. Hello to everyone that is watching us on Rumble. Hit that like button on Rumble, please. And to our locals community, the Duran.locals.com. How's everybody doing in the locals chat? And hello to everyone that is watching us on YouTube as well. A quick shout out to our moderators on YouTube. Peter the Great, how are you doing? Valley S, great to see you, Valley S, and Spartan Warrior Queen. Good to see you, Spartan Warrior Queen. Thank you to our moderators for everything that you do. And William Justice is also in the house. William Justice, how are you? All right, we are good to go. We have the one and only Mr. Dima from the Military Summary Channel. Dima, how are you doing today?
Hi, Alex. Hi, Alexander. I'm doing well today. As you can see, the situation in Ukraine is not so well as I'm doing today because I'm on the best ever show on YouTube and ever in the world, the Duran. And you know that Ukraine still haven't such possibility to be in your show, but I believe that soon they're going to be here as well. And the thing is that, as you know, the situation in Ukraine is very difficult, and not just in Ukraine. We see that there is a lot of complicated situation all over the front lines and all over the world, in China, in Russia, in Western countries, with the situation with the banks and so on. But I believe you have a lot of things to say about this, and I'm going to talk just about military situation in Ukraine, about my understanding of the situation, and when do I think this war is going to be ended? Because I believe that no matter the things that we learn from this war, no matter some benefits or not benefits we receive from this situation, anyway, we want this war to be ended as soon as possible. Absolutely. Because of casualties among civilians and so on, about the polluted air, about polluted weather, polluted nature, and so on. And as we know that, if you don't mind, I can share the screen maybe for better presentation.
Yes, absolutely. Before we get started, Dima, and I pass it off to Alexander so we could get started. Absolutely, you can share whatever you want on the screen. Is there anywhere else that people can follow you outside of YouTube? I have your link to your YouTube channel down below in the description box. Is there anywhere else that you would
I'm
like
using Rumble as well. So I'm using Rumble as well. So
okay,
yes,
so I will place.
Sure.
Okay, so I will place those links as a pinned comment as well when this live stream is finished. So Alexander, Dima, I pass it on to you, and let's get started.
Absolutely. Well, can I just say, first of all, that it's a privilege for us to have you on, Dima. You are one of in fact, a key authoritative source about the conduct, the progress of the war. I'm going to say that this is an extremely difficult subject for us to cover on the Duran. We completely share your view that this is a terrible war that we earnestly want to see ended. The loss of life, the destruction that has been caused by this war is horrific. And you're absolutely right also. It is acting as a major catalyst in changes in the international system in ways that nobody anticipated, I think, when it began. Not the Russians, not the Chinese, certainly not the Western powers. Things have turned out very differently from the way everybody thought it would. And you can see everybody is unsure exactly where we're going and how it's going to end and what the world will look like once it's ended. Certainly in London, where of course I'm based, I've said this many times, there's much doubt, much unhappiness about the general situation, still solid support to continue the war from the political class, but growing doubts, I think, about pretty much everything else, about the economic future, about the political future, about where things are going. I think the war, however, remains the central event. as wars do, by the way. I mean, they are the most important event that is going on, and I think we need to discuss the military situation. And you are perhaps the best person to explain it all to us, because, of course, it's very difficult sometimes to understand. So we're hearing lots about fighting in Bakhmut. We're hearing lots about fighting in Avdiivka. We're hearing lots about prospective Ukrainian counteroffensives. One near Bakhmut, a much bigger one being prepared over the next few weeks, presumably in the south of Ukraine. You've covered all these topics very thoroughly. I remember that the last time you appeared on this program, on our show, you were talking about the future Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, for example. So perhaps the best thing to do before we get into the sort of details, perhaps go into the weeds, is to ask you what you think the overall situation is and where we're going. And then we perhaps can start looking at the more individual parts of the very complex picture, as you rightly describe it.
I understand your question. The thing is that if we compare the situation in Ukraine today and with the situation in Ukraine a year ago, this is two completely different Ukraines. And I'm not talking about the people and about the situation, political sphere. I'm talking about the attitude to this ground from other countries. When talking about the previous year, we were talking about the existential war. The Russians were saying that war in Ukraine is kind of existential war for them. And the Ukrainians were saying the same. But today, nobody talks about existential war. Today, we hear just the talks about the weapon, new types of weapon. And as you know, today, the Britain announced that they will transfer depleted uranium munition to Ukraine. This is a terrible piece of news. And the thing is that Ukraine is no longer a place for some existential war. This is the place to test new weapon for everybody. And for example, if we compare Russia today on the 21st of March of 2023 with Russia on the same date a year ago, this is completely two different Russias. And the thing is that modern Russia a year after is much more powerful than the Russia a year ago. And not because of that they managed to survive under the sanctions and so on. I'm talking about the science. I'm talking about the military science. I'm talking about the difference between Russia a year ago and today. They have new weapon. They have tested new weapon. Then they received the most important answer, whether they are able to fight against NATO and whether they are able to stand against the NATO and US weapon. And the same thing we can say about the NATO countries in the United States as well. We can say that the NATO countries today and a year ago, it's two different blocks, two different countries, because now the NATO countries has the same answers to the same question, whether they are able to fight with the Russians, should they be afraid of the Russians or not. And most of the answers is yes, we can fight with the Russians, yes, we don't need to be afraid of them, and so on. So it's completely different situation. And so now, as I told you, the most important thing is to test the weapon and to find a solution, how to win this war, and for the Russians and for the NATO countries. And I see that solutions that the Russians have today, they're better than the Western countries. And these solutions help them to win this war step by step, very slowly. And their slowest is not because of their can't penetrate defense orders of Ukraine. The thing is that they need to have more answers. They need to create better weapon. They need to be sure for 100% that within the next 100 years, there are going to be no problem with the Western countries. There are going to be no more existential question for them. And to receive this answer, they need to receive this answer on the battlefield of Ukraine. And when talking from this perspective, we see that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians managed to test all types of rockets and missiles they have, all types of tanks, all types of armored vehicles that were produced during the Soviet period and that were produced during the modern Russia. They analyzed and understood what were the best investments and what was the worst investments. As we know, the Russians' missiles, Jager sonic missiles, is the best ever investments the Russians made since the beginning of its civilization, because now this is the only, not the nuclear weapon, but this hypersonic weapon is the only thing that maybe stops the Western countries to attack the Russia from all the sides. And when talking about the Western countries, they understood that they managed to, during the previous years, invest billions of dollars into internet, into satellites, into connection, into everything, all these types. And since the beginning of the special military operation, the Western countries managed to test armored vehicles, their trainings, their courses, their program of training soldiers according to the NATO standards. They managed to test their logistics. Now, as you know, the Western countries supply Ukraine with shells that are produced in South Korea. Imagine yourself, where is South Korea and where is Ukraine? So now the NATO can surely say that we have a perfect logistic, because we are able to establish production anywhere in the world and supply any point in the world with any type of weapon. And this is a very big benefit. It is a very big benefit for the NATO countries. Furthermore, the Western countries are managed to develop to test their HIMARS systems, and now they know that this is exactly the type of weapon they need to invest in. They have tested and many other things. For example, they tested their rockets like HARM, but they didn't provide any results. Those rockets that when you launch these rockets, and if they spot during their flight the enemy radar, they change their goal and they attack enemy radar. But we haven't seen the progress. And during the previous years, the states invested billions of dollars to develop this rocket. And now they understand that this is like some kind of investment that were waste, and many other things. And now we see that there is a new area has come, and now the Western countries are going to test their tanks. And not just tanks, but tanks that can attack the Russians with the uranium bullets, uranium shells. Yeah. So this is another step of war. This is another understanding of the necessity of this or that investments into military science. And when people ask me, for example, how do I think when this war is going to be ended? From this perspective, I'm telling them that we're not going to see the end of this war until we see the real fights in the air between F-16 and Su-57 or Su-35. At least this is going to be some kind of a flag. And as soon as we start seeing the battles in the sky between air forces of one and another country, real battles as we used to see during the Second World War, this is going to be, we can say, or the final test situation or pre-final, because the final test is the nuclear weapon. And I hope that nobody is going to start testing this weapon on the territory of Ukraine or anywhere else. And this thing tells me from other perspective, we see that there is some kind of military race. It's not just a war, it's a military race with the real battlefield where the countries are able to test their weapon, their technologies, their science. And we see that the Russians are pretty good in this military race with the NATO bloc. So people are saying that sometimes people are saying that Russia is the second military army in the world and they couldn't establish control over Ukraine, but Ukraine is supported by the NATO bloc. So we can say that NATO bloc is not enough powerful to stop the Russians. So it's the same logic, but people don't want to believe and don't want to understand this. But from the other side, we see that NATO country is very good at military science as well. We know that the United States started their own program of hypersonic weapon, and they're pretty successful. They're investing money, and they know what are they doing. They see the result of the Russians. They see what are they doing. And now we see some kind of, it's the first roots of upcoming greatest war, but not the hot war. I believe, in my understanding of the situation, that this war in Ukraine sooner or later will be transferred into Cold War of military race, another military race that we used to see in the previous century. And I hope so, because it's much more better when we are trying to develop science, culture, and so on, than we kill each other on the ground or something like this. But also, this situation tells me, if somebody asks me when this war is going to be ended, that we see that the Russians and the NATO country has already been involved into military race. And we can say that like 50-50, they're both goes shoulder to shoulder. And as I told at the beginning, if we compare Russia and NATO with the same countries a year ago, this is two completely different instances. And there is one important difficulty with this situation. If we compare China today and China a year ago, we see that this is the same China. And this is the main problem for the Chinese. And in my videos on my channel, I'm telling the people that sooner or later we're going to see how China is going to engage in how they're going to join this military race, not because they support Russia, not because they're against NATO countries, because they need to receive the same answer that NATO countries and Russia has already received, whether their weapon are able to stand against, let's say, NATO weapon or let's say Russia weapon. They need to know this. And the only possible way how to know this, how to understand this, is to start the same race. So this is the reason I believe all these meetings between Comrade C and Putin is a part of, let's say, China lend-lease that almost the same lend-lease we used to see during the Second World War. But at that moment, there was like US lend-lease to Soviet Union. But today we're going to see Chinese lend-lease. And today we know that Chinese have already prepared a significant infrastructure in Belarus, in Russia, trying to avoid sanctions. They have already prepared a lot of industrial zones in Belarus. There are a lot of flights. They're bringing more parts. They're creating more and more weapons. Furthermore, even if we compare Iran with China, we see that Iran today is completely different Iran in comparison with the previous year. I'm talking about the military science. Even Iran managed to develop their own weapon, their own missiles. They managed to sign a lot of contracts with the Russians, and they have at least examples of Su-35, Su-37 airplanes. They are able to understand and to build their own, as they did with the drones. And even Iran is a completely different country in comparison with the previous year. Yeah. And China see this problem, and China will start support the Russians because they need to get the answer whether they are able to fight. You might ask myself, why the Chinese need to answer this question, all these questions. We know, and I believe you discussed this topic also on your channel, that some NATO of military authorities are saying that on the 2025 or 2027, there's going to be another conflict in the vicinity of Taiwan, in Taiwan region. And the Chinese, they need to receive an answer today, not in 2027, somewhere in the sea, to be destroyed by the NATO countries in one day, and then to ask ourselves, how did that happen? They need to receive this answer today on the battlefield of Ukraine, whether they are able to stand against NATO weapon then near Taiwan, and they need to get this answer today. So this is about the answer to the question about my understanding of this situation. So that's mean that this war is going to be, I don't know when this war is going to be ended. I don't know.
This is an extraordinary answer, if I may say so, Dima, because of course it reminds me, I mean, I was a historian once upon a time, long ago, but it's always been my most interesting subject. But it's, of course, what you remind me, the way you've described it, is what happened in Spain in the 1930s, when the two major military powers in Europe, which were Germany and the Soviet Union, used the war in Spain in exactly the way that you said. They sent their military equipment there. The Germans sent their tanks. They sent their aircraft. The Soviets did exactly the same. People don't understand that, but they absolutely did. They were testing their weapons. They were testing their weapons against each other. The Soviets redesigned their fighter fleets based on their experiences in Spain. So, fighters like, the famous Yak 3, I think that's what it's called. The Yak 3 fighter jet was partly a response to the fact that they encountered the Messerschmitt fighter jets, the German Messerschmitt fighter jets in Spain. And of course, they looked at each other's tactics. They understood each other's technologies. And of course, what that meant was that Spain was a precursor. It was a kind of dress rehearsal for what eventually became the Second World War. And I'm not suggesting, well, I hope not, that we're in a World War III type scenario. But sometimes, a little bit of what you said, it sounds almost like that we're heading towards a major conflict between the great powers, and that the great powers are now preparing. They're testing their weapons. They're refining their military concepts. They're restructuring their armed forces. They're understanding what each is doing, and they're preparing for for the much bigger showdown which is to come. That is a disturbing thought, but it's not without historical parallels. As I say, if you look at Spain, you can see that. If you go back further, by the way, before the First World War, to the conflict in Southern Africa, the South African Wars, what the British refer to as the Boer Wars. There's an awful lot of that as well. I mean, the British learned an awful lot about how about modern wars should be fought. And of course, the Germans were also there too, to an extent that isn't widely known. And by the way, so were the Russians. Again, lots of things that people don't know about. There's rather a disturbing thought, but not one without historical parallels. And, well, is that why Xi Jinping is in Moscow now? It's meetings to discuss principally weapons supplies, to discuss
weapon supplies,
military thinking, sharing technologies, those kind of things.
Logistic, military technologies, of course, the price, the payments for this, and responsibilities, of course. And you saw the picture, you saw the videos, and I believe we understand that there are a lot of contracts, lots of documents have been signed or would be signed. And I believe that when talking about Ukraine, they have an endless support from the Western countries. And this piece of news about the uranium depleted shells are telling that they're not going to stop. And the message from Moscow, we see that China is going to provide endless support from their side as well. We're not going to see this immediately. We are not going to see tomorrow like millions of trucks or planes flying in direction of Russia with support. It will be an ongoing process, step by step. But as the more the conflict escalates, the more supply and support we're going to see from China. And when talking about Russia, we understand that they do need supply and support from China. They need support in finance. They need support, just immediate support, because as you know, and I discussed this situation with my people, that sooner or later we are going to be witnesses of another mobilization process on the territory of Russian Federation. And the previous mobilization the Russians made in the let's say in autumn of the previous year, and the Russians made this mobilization exactly at the moment when the Russians were changing their uniform. So the Russians are trying to make mobilization not because of the situation on the ground. Of course, if the situation is critical, they don't have any other options, then they need to make another wave of mobilization. But when talking about this special operation, the Russians are trying to use their resources wisely. So they started their mobilization during the autumn period, because that was exactly the period of time when the Russians changed their uniform from the summer uniform to winter uniform. And this is a perfect time, because if you start mobilization, let's say in summer, you need first provide your army with summer uniform, then you need to you train these forces according to the summer weather, and then you launching this offensive operation, these soldiers into winter. So they're completely unprepared for this situation. And now it's March, the end of March and the beginning of April. The Russians changes and one more time their uniform from winter to spring uniform to summer uniform, and this is the best time to start another wave of mobilization. And some Russian sources are saying, for example, maybe you heard about such a source like Rybar from the Russian side. He has already started some kind of discussion about the possible mobilization, and some other sources are saying that during the entire winter period, the Russian industry was completely focused on production of summer uniform. So they're going to start. But uniform is not, of course, the only thing that determine whether the Russians need to start or not. They need weapon. And during the winter period of time, the Russians managed to save their army. If we compare these two different period of time, the first one before winter, before, let's say, the autumn, after the greatest Ukraine offensive operation, and after, we see that during the first period of special offensive operation, the Russians established control over Mariupol, they stormed the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, without any mobilization, by the way. And during the first period, they had some losses. It's very difficult. There are no numbers all over the internet where we can find the real numbers of Russian losses, but we understand that they lost some tanks, some equipment, and many other things. And later the Russians announced mobilization, and during the winter period of time they managed to save the army, because during the winter period of time we see that Wagnerians was the only force from the Russian side who made active some actions on the front line. They were storming Bakhmut, and they continue doing this right now. And as we know, Bakhmut have already appeared in some kind of operational encirclement. Some sources are saying that this is already tactical encirclement. Some sources are calling this situation as a cauldron, because Ukrainian forces are completely blocked inside of this town, and they are no longer able to unblock their forces there. Some sources are saying that there are around 10 or 20,000 soldiers inside of Bakhmut. So that's a lot. Believe me, it's 20,000 soldiers to get blocked inside the town, to lose just because you haven't managed to get them out at the time you need it, and now you need to unblock them. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are saying that they continue accumulation of the forces on the line between Slavyansk and Kramatorsk for unblocking operation, and according to the Ukrainian sources, the only barrier that stops the Ukrainians before this unblocking operation is the weather. It's the south of Ukraine. It's already a spring, and the weather is very bad there, and the quality of the ground is very poor. So that's why the Ukrainians can't use the broad front lines attack to penetrate the Wagnerians' defense orders, to push them back, or at least to cut them from supply and support from the mainland. So the thing is that during the winter period of time, we see that the main actions made Wagnerians, and they had the main losses. Of course, there is a very heavy clashes on Liman front line near Kremenaya forest. The Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians back from the Liman bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk River. And you see that this war started a year ago, and we are still continue talking about Seversky Donetsk River and the forest. If you remember, when was the retreat process of the Ukrainians from the Lysychansk, if you remember my idea that I suggested the Ukrainians to step back through the same forest, and that was a crazy idea. We discussed this in the previous show, if you remember. And now there is the same clashes in the same forest. There are very heavy clashes in Avdiivka, and this is the second area where the Russians opened another, let's say, the front line. But as I understand, and according to my information, according to data I have, this is not the final attack from the Russian side. It's the same tactic as we used to see from the Ukrainian side. First, they were attacking in Kherson, then they attack in Kharkiv, then they repeat their attack in Kherson there. So usually when talking about the military science, there should be at least 3 waves of attack in different directions. And the main goal is to stretch the enemy's reserve. So the Russians started the first attack in Bakhmut during the winter period of time. Now is the beginning of the spring, and the Russians started encirclement of Avdiivka. And we can obviously tell that Avdiivka has already appeared in operational encirclement as well. And so now there are 2 encirclements on the battlefield, and I expect that the Russians are going to make another 3rd attack. And the way the Russians are going to determine which to use for another attack depends on the Ukrainian decision which reserves to use to unblock Avdiivka and Bakhmut. For example, it doesn't mean that the Russians have just one plan. I think that the Russians have maybe 10 documents or 10 plans to attack from many sides, and from the border with Belarus, and in Kharkiv and Chernigov and even Odessa and even Transnistria, a lot of places. The thing is, where the Ukrainians are going to use reserves to unblock forces in Avdiivka and Bakhmut. And we know that Ukrainians are no longer able to use reserves that were accumulated in the vicinity of Zaporozhye, because Zaporozhye is completely prepaid action from the Western countries. They were planning this operation in the south of Zaporozhye since the beginning of special operation, to push the Russians from Zaporozhye, to return control over the nuclear power plant, to cut the supply roads, and to show immediate victory from the Western countries. So that's why I don't think that Zelensky are able to get some reserves from Zaporozhye. And furthermore, by the way, if you know, now there are clashes in Bakhmut, and the For example, there is a Syrsky, the head of infantry army of Ukraine. He's responsible for defense of Bakhmut, and this is the same person who was responsible for the same defense of Debaltseve in 2015 when the Russians, when this situation just started. And as you know, in 2015, the same commander appeared in the Cauldron in Debaltseve. And now, after, let's say, 8 years, the same commander appeared almost in the same situation in Bakhmut. Maybe he wants some kind of revenge from his side to I don't know, to show somebody to something. But we see that Ukrainians have significant losses just because of the fact that they are trying to hold the town that nobody needs.
I mean, I didn't know about Syrsky being the commander at Debaltseve. I have to say, I mean, if I was a Ukrainian and I knew that, that wouldn't inspire me. I mean, I remember that battle very, very well. Not the military aspects of it, but the political effects. And I mean, that didn't seem to me like a well-managed battle from a Ukrainian point of view at all. And that's putting it mildly. Do you think there is going to be an attempt to unblock Bakhmut? Do you think there is going to, I mean, do you think the Ukrainians are going to do it? Because I've seen some people skeptical that they can actually, that their forces are too stretched along the front lines, and that the political imperative to carry out this offensive in Zaporozhye is too strong, as you said, for them to divert enough troops to make a really effective push in Bakhmut and those sorts of places.
The thing is that the Ukrainians, at least before the Russians started their storm operation or encirclement operation of Avdiivka, before that, the Ukrainians were planning to start unblocking operation. They were planning because around, let's say, from 10 to 20,000 soldiers are stuck inside of Bakhmut. It's around 5 brigades, experienced brigades. 20,000 soldiers. It's a very powerful army. And if they don't stop unblocking operation, they will lose the entire corps, the entire military corps. And it's going to be disaster. And I'm not sure that Ukrainians are able to even to survive after such a loss. So that's why they were planning to unblock. And everything was almost ready to start the unblocking operation, but according to the Ukrainian sources, the weather was the barrier that stopped the Ukrainians before doing that. And this week, the Ukrainians were planning to do this. In 2 days, every single day we receive a piece of news from the Ukrainian sources that tomorrow, in 2 days, in 4 days, they're going to start. And by the way, if the Ukrainians are saying, usually they're doing this, we can at least from the past we see that they were saying about counteroffensive operation in August, and they started this offensive operation in August exactly. So we can believe the Ukrainians, at least what they're saying about offensive operation, because in the past they didn't lie us. So if they're saying that they're planning to start unblocking operation, so I think that we need to believe them. But the Russians started their offensive operation in Avdiivka. And when the Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians in the vicinity of Bakhmut, they were forced to bring strategical reserves from all over the front line. They moved the reserves from Ugledar. They moved the reserves from Marinka, from Avdiivka, from Toretsk, New York, from Seversk, from Kremenaya, from Liman, from Kharkiv. They were trying to collect their forces from the entire Ukraine and to send them to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk with one purpose. First, to slow down the Russians and then to unblock Bakhmut. So that was their goal. But then suddenly the Russians started their offensive operation in Avdiivka. And now the Ukrainians need to take a decision where they are able to take more reserves, but now to unblock Avdiivka. And they understand that there are few possible areas that Ukrainians are able to use for unblocking Avdiivka reserves. I mean, they can use the Zaporozhye reserves, but as we discussed, this is completely prepaid operation by the NATO countries. These forces are completely under control of NATO forces. They started preparation of this operation very long time ago. So I don't think that NATO and Western officers are going to give the Ukrainians any reserves to unblock Avdiivka and Bakhmut. The second front line is Ugledar. But we know that, if you remember, in the beginning of this year, there was a very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Ugledar. The Russians were trying to storm, but as we know, at least the video and photo sources are saying that the Russians were a little bit defeated in the vicinity of Ugledar. I'm not saying, I can't tell you about the goals that the Russians were planning to achieve. Maybe that was the goals, just to reduce the Ukrainian army and to force them to fight. Maybe that was the goals, and if that was the goals, then the Russians was pretty successful, because now the Ukrainians understand that they can't take forces from Ugledar as another, let's say, strategical area to move them in direction of Avdiivka or Bakhmut, because in this case, the Russians can make another attempt, and now the Russians will be able to penetrate the defense orders and to establish control over Ugledar. So the Ukrainians, I don't think they're going to risk with this area. They will keep everything as is. When talking about Avdiivka itself, the sources are saying that currently, during the previous week, when this operation started, the Ukrainians had just 1,200 soldiers of operational reserves. From one side, we can say that this is a pretty big number. But if you remember, during the battle for Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were losing up to 1 battalion per day. And 1 battalion is something around 500 soldiers, 500 soldiers. So that means that Ukrainians had of intensive, of very powerful clashes, they had reserves just for 2 days. So 1,200 is just for 2 days of heavy clashes, if the Russians take a decision to drop everything they have, but to take this town. So it's nothing. It's nothing. So that's why, if we are talking about Bakhmut, and now we are going to Bakhmut, we know that during the previous months, the Ukrainians managed to accumulate some powerful attack feats to unblock Bakhmut. There are a lot of brigades, and now there is a question. There is some kind of decision. The Ukrainians need to make a decision, or to start unblocking process with the forces they have, or to take some part and move back to Avdiivka, and not to allow the Russians to complete this encirclement process. And this is the reason why, and now this is the main job of Wagnerians, because as you can see, during the previous weeks, like in February, in the beginning of the March, we saw a lot of updates from the Russian side. The Wagnerians took Paraskovyevka, Krasnaya Gora, Solidar, many other towns. Almost every single day we got another piece of news about establishing control over another town. But today is March, and we see that almost since the beginning of the March, we don't see any progress in the vicinity of Bakhmut. And this is not because the Wagnerians are not able to take control over these territories around Bakhmut. Yes, they're on the lowland, Ukrainians on the hills, and so on. But the thing is that all this operation in Avdiivka was planned a very long time ago. And it's my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm some kind of speculation. But as I understand, it was a decision to make a small operational pause around Avdiivka, around Bakhmut. When talking about Bakhmut itself as the town, there are very heavy clashes inside the town. The Russians established control over the industrial zone in the north, on the south, and many other territories. They're pushing inside, but they're not developing their bridgehead around Bakhmut. And that was a decision, someone's decision. And now the Ukrainians need to make their own decision, or to move reserves to Avdiivka from Bakhmut or not. And I believe that within the next few days, we're going to see some activation from Wagnerians. And their main job for now, not to allow the Ukrainians to move reserves from Bakhmut to Avdiivka. They need to pin down these forces and to freeze these reserves exactly in Slaviansk-Kramatorsk. So to make another trap and not to allow them to evacuate from this area in direction of Avdiivka. So with Bakhmut, we understand. There are two more front lines, Kupiansk and Liman front line, where Ukrainians are able to take reserves to save the situation in Avdiivka. And when talking about Kupiansk, there were very heavy clashes since the beginning of the storm process of Bakhmut. The level of losses from the Ukrainian side on that front line is almost the same level as the level of losses of Ukrainians on the Bakhmut front line. 160 soldiers per day, dozens of armored vehicles, and so on. So that means that the Ukrainian forces in Crimea are also pretty damaged as the Ukrainian forces near Ugledar. So these two regions, the Ukrainians can't use the reserves from these two regions to send them to Avdiivka. When talking about Kupiansk, there are not much forces at all. There are fields, and the Ukrainians have already started preparation of another defense line very far from the border with Russia, because they understand that if something is going to happen for them, maybe it's even better to step back towards more reliable position, as close as possible to the railroad, to the Kharkiv, and so on. So according to the situation, we can say that there are no reserves, strategical reserves, that Ukrainians can use to save the situation in the vicinity of Avdiivka. And furthermore, during the previous weeks, there were a lot of updates that Ukrainians started redeployment of their forces from the border with Belarus, from Sumy region, from the border in direction of Bakhmut. Before that, they prepared the fields, they mined the fields, they prepared 3 or 2 or 4 lines of defense, and only after they sent the forces. But anyway, we see that Ukrainians are forced to weak some positions, let's say on the border with Belarus, on the border with Bryansk Oblast, and this is exactly what the Russians need. This is exactly what the Russians need before their third strike. Because I believe there is going to be a third strike, and the Russians are going to strike exactly in the area where they see the Ukrainians have their weakest position.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. Can I ask a question? Because, of course, it's one that is constantly discussed here in Britain and in the United States. Why is Ukraine trying to hold on to Bakhmut? I mean, I am not a military person at all. I have little understanding of military affairs, and I say this frankly. I've had to cover, this war, but it's something that is well outside what we in Britain call my personal comfort zone. It's something that is alien to me in many ways. I don't understand why Ukraine has clung on to Bakhmut so obsessively for so long at such heavy cost. Now, I've heard explanations. There are explanations I've seen from third sources that, if you lose Bakhmut, it opens the way to places like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, takes you all the way up to the Dnieper eventually if these other places fall. Is this correct? Is this why they're holding on? The Americans don't seem to be happy. The British, I can tell you, definitely are not happy. They think that Ukraine has invested too much in the defense of this town.
The thing is that we can find a lot of explanations, and I believe that all of them are going to be correct, because any of this explanation means some benefits for the Russians. And the most obvious thing why the Ukrainians are trying to keep and hold Bakhmut is because they have a 20,000 army have already stacked inside of Bakhmut, and they are no longer able to evacuate these forces. So this is like the explanation that located on the top. So 20,000 army. So it's well-trained officers. Furthermore, some sources were saying that Syrsky itself is in Bakhmut. He's trying to coordinate the battle for this town. So this situation reminds me of the situation with Stalingrad during the Second World War. So this is the first explanation, that on top, that there are a lot of forces that Ukrainians can't evacuate. As you know, there is just a short corridor between Kromova and Ivanovska, these two villages that are located on the west side of Bakhmut. And the distance between these two towns is just 5 kilometers. And the Russians control this area with artillery. They can't control this area easily, and they attack 24 hours a day these territories, trying to reduce every single unit that try to cross these fields and these roads and so on. So this is the first thing. Another thing is that the Bakhmut is located on the railroad that we can say connects Donetsk and Moscow. So if you take a look at the map, you're going to see that Donetsk doesn't have any connections with Moscow using the railroad. And of course, nobody knows how this war is going to be finished. Maybe there's going to be ceasefire, maybe there's going to be some peace agreement, I don't know. But no matter, let's say, if the Russians are not able to establish control over entire Ukraine or to change the situation, let's say to put their own authorities, like their own like president or something like this, anyway, they need to improve their logistic, their industrial things in the area. And to do this, they need to take Bakhmut. There is a railroad that goes Gorlovka, Donetsk, Gorlovka, Bakhmut, Seversk, Liman, Kremenaya, Moscow. So anyway, the Russians will do everything they can, but they need to return back control over this important logistic area. Furthermore, if the Russians are able to take Bakhmut, Seversk, Liman, Kremenaya, they will be able to improve their logistic, and they will be able to solve a lot of issues before the greatest offensive operation in direction of Slaviansk, Kramatorsk. Of course, they will need to restore the railroads and so on. But we know that the Russians are pretty experienced in these engineering things, and they will be able to restore the bridges and the railroad within half a year, and then it will improve their positions, and it will allows them to continue their offensive operation to return control over entire territory of DPR and LPR, and furthermore of Zaporozhye and Kherson region.
Right. And can I just ask about Avdiivka then? I mean, because what is the importance of Avdiivka? I mean, one hears that the Ukrainians use it to shell Donetsk, but does it have a bigger military significance beyond that? I mean, is it some place that is as important to the two sides as Bakhmut has turned out to be?
When talking about this area, there is Avdiivka, and the Ukrainians, as you told me, as you just said, uses Avdiivka for shelling and attacking Donetsk, and the level of losses among civilians since the beginning of special operation is already more than 1,000 people, I believe so, as a result of all these shellings, not just Donetsk, but the entire DPR and LPR as well, just civilians under shelling attacks. So, of course, furthermore, the Ukrainians use Avdiivka not just to attack the buildings, residential area, they're attacking industrial area, they attack the places that the Russians are using to supply the houses with the water, with electricity, and we understand that Ukrainians are not going to stop doing this ever. So the first thing, the Russians need to keep the normal situation to these people, because these people, I'm talking about DPR and LPR, they believe the Russians and they put on them. So they strike on them. So they support them, and they don't have any other options, by the way, because 9 years passed since the beginning of this entire story, and they understand that if they are not going to support Russia, then might be a lot of problems, because if the Ukrainians are able to establish control over DPR, I believe we are going to see another act of genocide in the world, and we are going to see this. It's like, for me, it's obviously. So this is the reason the Russians need to provide security, or at least the feeling of security, to the people. It's the first reason, and for these purposes, they need to push Ukrainian force from Avdiivka, because the Ukrainians are using this town to correct and to target their artillery system. The second thing is that behind Avdiivka, there is another big important town by the name of Pakrovsk. This is a very powerful logistic hub that Ukrainians uses to supply and support Avdiivka, Ugledar, Kurakhova, New York agglomeration, Toretsk, Bakhmut, Konstantinovka. And Pakrovsk is the town that's located between Zaporozhye and, let's say, Donbass front line, and all the places where we can see clashes right now. So without taking Avdiivka, highly unlikely the Russians are able to get Pakrovsk, and Pakrovsk is a part of DPR. So according to the Donetsk Oblast, the Donetsk region, when talking about the ex-Ukraine as a region of ex-Ukraine or something like this. So anyway, if the Russians, furthermore, we understand that according to the Russians' goals, they are saying that they want, at least now, they want to complete one thing, to return control over DPR and LPR. So for now, this is the most important goal for them when talking about the media. At least they're saying this. And if the Russians want to return control over Slaviansk and Kramatorsk, I believe to attack these towns in front, like Wagnerians are doing right now when talking about Bakhmut, is not a very good solution. Of course, the Russians are able to take any town attacking this town in front, but this is not the question of whether they are able or not. This is the question of the price of lives they are going to pay for this. And of course, the Russians, nobody wants to lose the manpower. Nobody wants to lose the soldiers. Nobody wants to have problems at home. So that's why the only solution I see is to encircle this agglomeration from the north and from the south. From the north, that means that the Russians sooner or later will be forced to activate their offensive operation from Kremenaya in direction of the Liman front line, and from the south, the Russians need to attack or from Ugledar, but we saw the results of the previous attack in direction of Ugledar. The Russians, as I told you, was a little bit defeated in this area, and now we see a small penetration in the vicinity of Avdiivka. So from Avdiivka, the Russians can start encirclement of Kramatorsk-Slaviansk agglomeration from the south and from the west. So a lot of things, a lot of benefits this town, and the most important, the spirit of Russian army. The win for Avdiivka is going to bring significant inspiration for Russian soldiers and for Russian forces, for Russian, population, and not just for Russia. Many other countries, support Russia. Syria, Belarus, China, North Korea, many other countries who support Russia will be inspired by this victory.
Right. What about this offensive in Zaporozhye that we're hearing all about, which the West is absolutely fixated on? I mean, this is the British media is full of it. The American media is full of it. American officials are pushing it very, very much on Ukraine. I have two questions. Firstly, is this a bad idea? I mean, that's an obvious one, because some people are saying that Ukraine isn't strong enough to succeed in this offensive, at least not to achieve all its objectives. And secondly, is this a case of the Western powers imposing on Ukraine strategic ideas, in other words, this offensive, which perhaps Ukraine might be better advised not pursuing, and instead focusing on the defense of these places that you've been talking about, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Kremenaya, and the rest?
As you know, this is 2023 is pre-election year. The next year there are going to be elections all over the world. In the United States of America, as far as I know, in the Russian Federation, and in Ukraine, there are going to be elections. And the best thing that the president or the candidate for this role can provide is victories. That if the Ukrainians are able to hold Bakhmut, of course it's a victory, but it's not immediate victory. You can't go to, let's say, to the Britain Parliament with the words that we managed to defeat the Russians near Bakhmut, give us more money. I think that this is not the case when the Western investors can support you with more money and weapon. And that's why I believe that these people, like leaders who want to, they need victories, and they need a voice. They need a noise around themselves. And to tell the truth, they need a positive noise. I'm talking about the victories and so on. This is like the first thing about the Zaporozhye area. Furthermore, I believe that the operation, the greatest counteroffensive operation in Zaporozhye, was created not yesterday, and not even the day before yesterday. This operation, I believe, was created even maybe somewhere in the August of the previous year. I believe that the Western countries managed to think and analyze and to create this step-by-step plan. I believe that they have a certain plan for every single square meter in this area. I believe that they have every single soldier who knows, or at least they know where exactly they will send him to do this or that. They have already developed their spy network in this area. They have already, you heard this, you saw the situation with the drone that we saw at the beginning of this week or the end of the previous week, when the Russian plane dropped the US drone, and that this is also a part of this situation. So they have already invested millions or maybe billions of dollars in preparation of this war. The current support of Ukraine with the modern weapon, Western weapon, with Abrams, Challengers, and many other tanks, Leopards, all these tanks were supplied for this operation. So I don't think that this is something stupid. I don't think so. Maybe if the Western countries, NATO countries, haven't created any plan, yes, in this case that would be a stupid idea. But I believe that they have something to show. I believe so, because they spent too much time to prepare, and they mainly concentrated on this operation. The question is whether the Russians are able to understand the plans of the NATO countries and to prevent all their attempts and to break all their attempts. I don't know. I don't know, because
No.
again, when talking about the previous experience, the Ukrainians during the previous year, during the special military operation, made 2 counteroffensive operations. The first one in Kherson and the second one in Kharkiv area, and both of them were successful. So I don't remember any counteroffensive operation from the Ukrainian side that ended unsuccessfully. I don't know this. We haven't seen. So that's why this is also something that we need to understand. And I hope that the Russians do have people, do have experts, and do have people who can analyze and to prevent this counteroffensive operation and not to lose this territory. Because in other case, it will be, to tell the truth, a little bit ridiculous, because you knew about this operation since the beginning of the special military operation and you haven't been prepared. So it's a little bit strange, could be. So I believe that yeah, it's going to be a very powerful attack from the Ukrainian side.
I have to say, just to confirm what you've just said, I saw the first discussion of this Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye region. I can remember it was in September. that was when I first saw people talking about this. They were saying, Kharkov, Kherson, these are important things, but the real offensive is going to come in Zaporozhye region to cut the land corridor, and that it was going to go for Melitopol and Mariupol. So just to confirm exactly what you've been saying there, let's talk about some of the technologies, because like yourself, I am deeply, deeply disturbed by this news about depleted uranium being shells appearing on the battlefronts, and I'm really shocked that my country, Britain, is the first country to be providing these shells. Can you explain to us all what these things do? I mean, I've heard some particularly horrifying stories about the damage, the pollution that they can cause, but what is their military purpose?
Every type of weapon has one military purpose: to destroy as much as possible of manpower of your enemy. So this is the only purpose of this weapon, to destroy as much as possible manpower of the enemy. But there is a few cases. For example, first you attack, and let's say you can wound some soldier or something like this, but let's say he can be saved in hospital after this wound and something like this. But when talking about this type of weapon, the chances to survive, even for wounded soldiers, is very low. And even if they survive, they can got a lot of diseases and illnesses, and they will sooner or later they will die. Furthermore, this weapon is very dangerous, not just for soldiers but also for the territory. So by providing this weapon, the British are saying, even if we are going to lose this territory, let's say Zaporozhye, because I believe that they're going to use this type of weapon in Zaporozhye. If we are going to be defeated and we are going to lose Zaporozhye, believe me, we will not allow you to use this ground for many, many hundreds of years because of pollution, of nuclear pollution on this territory. So it's terrible thing, and this is the main things, like to pollute the ground and not to allow people to use this ground in the future. Furthermore, to increase the level of losses among wounded people after the battle. And the second thing is the power of explosions and the power of damage that these shells are able to deal is significantly higher than in comparison with the regular shells and the regular ammo.
I know some people, and people with military backgrounds who see them as a significant step towards using nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm not suggesting that these are nuclear weapons, but they are based on nuclear technologies. They derive ultimately from the nuclear industry. and that they see use of these weapons as a very major escalatory step and a very threatening one. And I have to say, given the amount of criticisms, the amount of claims we've had in London about, the Russians using nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons and all that, it does seem to me deeply troubling that, in fact, it's the British who've taken this first step. Do you think, what will the Russians do in response? Will they just absorb this? Will they simply respond to this? Or will they escalate? I mean, do they have weapons of their own like this?
As I know Russians, I believe, first of all, we need to understand one important thing, and we can also find these examples in the past of this special operation. When the Western countries are saying that we are going to provide Leopards, that means that they are already on the territory of Ukraine.
Yeah.
When the Britain are saying that they are going to provide these types of weapons, that means that they are already on the territory of Ukraine. Furthermore, a few months ago, or maybe a few weeks ago, there was a piece of news when the Russians were saying that they managed to discover or spot some kind of radiational signal in Odessa port. Furthermore, they reported that a few workers from that port got some nuclear diseases, these things, and they appeared in hospitals. So there was a few updates saying that maybe these types of weapons have already arrived on the territory of Ukraine. And when talking about Russia, of course, the Russians, as I understand, are not going to use any types of nuclear weapon against Ukraine. They're not even going to use the same type of weapon as they call it in English, depleted uranium munition. They're not going to use this. And even if the Russians are going to do something like this, let's call it like this, they will try to get these shells by some special operation. Let's say the easiest one is to buy these shells from some Ukrainian officers who are willing to earn easy money. Let's say it's the easiest explanation. Of course, I don't think that is going to be something like this, but anyway. And if even the Russians are going to do this, first they're going to get this weapon. And the worst thing they can do is, under cover of some terrorist, let's say, organization like ISIS, to send this weapon back to Britain, to some, let's say, residential area, and telling to the worldwide that this weapon got into the black market, then this weapon was bought by some terrorist organization, and now you can see this weapon on your own streets or something like this. And this is the worst and maximum thing that the Russians are able to do, not even with their own weapon, but just like to make a small warning that, guys, this weapon you can get your own weapon on your own streets if you're going to continue doing this. And also, it's a complete speculation from my side. And I'm not even sure that the Russians are going to do this, because there are a lot of people and there are a lot of organizations in the world who can do exactly as I told you, to get on the black market, to get this weapon for millions of dollars, the same ISIS, the same terrorist organization, and to bring this weapon back to Germany, to Berlin, to London, to France, and many, many other towns all over Europe. And this is the solution. And believe me, this is going to be exactly like this.
It's an absolutely shocking thought. And I have to say, we've already seen weapons supplied to Ukraine appearing in the black market. And adding on top of that, deadly weapons like these depleted uranium shells is extremely disturbing indeed. It's a terrifying thought to me. Gosh. Well, I'm going to just turn now once briefly back to the meeting with Xi Jinping and Putin, because we've had a whole succession of meetings. There was 2 meetings yesterday. There's another massive one going on today. The Prime Minister Mishustin, has had a meeting with Xi Jinping as well. Xi Jinping has come with an enormous delegation. There's apparently going to be more talks before he leaves tomorrow. This is an enormously complex series of discussions. We hear there's going to be gas, that's obviously energy, food, science and technology, all of that. Then Xi Jinping goes back to China, before long, he's going to be hosting Lula da Silva from Brazil, who's going to be in Beijing for 5 days. We've got Xi Jinping going to Saudi Arabia. He's talking with the Saudis. He's talking with the Iranians. He's bringing them together. We've had Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus. He's visited Iran, Russia, China. All of these leaders talking with each other. They're not just talking about weapons, it seems to me. They're talking about lots of other things too. Is this all binding everything together? Are we going to start to see more and more economic trade links, those kind of things starting to evolve over the next few months, years, perhaps?
I believe that that with people, of course, now in the world there are a lot of camps. Somebody supports NATO, somebody supports Russia, somebody supports China, and Western countries. But to tell the truth, if we remember 10 years ago, we lived in a very interesting world. It was a very nice time when everybody all over the world could get dollar and buy with the dollar everything and everywhere he can. We were able to earn money all over the world without any problems. And the stability of the previous world was supported by dollar as the universal payment method. And the most important with this dollar is that was your dollar, you earned this dollar, and nobody can take this dollar from you. This is this was the respect of your property on dollar. And now we see the situation when there is no respect. If you have dollar, it doesn't mean that you will have this dollar tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow you will wake up and you see that all your bank accounts are blacked and so on. And you can't use this dollar. You were working hard to earn this money, and now you can't spend this money. And I'm not talking about the Western countries because you haven't faced this problem. But we here in this part of the world have faced this problem. For example, from my side, I was forced to change 5 banks in Belarus to find the bank that can receive dollars for some services or something like my earnings or something like this. It's a big problem for people. And of course, now these guys, Comrade Xi, Putin, they need to find a solution. They need to find another method of payments between them, at least between them. And in time, of course, we need to understand that sooner or later, European Union will be forced to respect this new payment method. And they will do this because anyway, this war is going to be ended. Anyway, the connections will be restored, and we are going to see the completely new world. But dollar is not going to be the only currency for the payment exchanges, information, and so on. So this is the main topic: the bank, the World Bank, or analog of the World Bank, and of course the payment method. Of course, you heard a lot about the new types of currency. It's very difficult for me to translate in English. I didn't prepare this topic for discussion. Like electro dollar, like I don't know
digital,
how to call it.
The digital currency.
Digital dollar, digital currencies. This is the future. This is the future, and you saw the problems in the banks, and digital currency is the future. And there is one important difference, at least from sources I read, between the current currency and the digital currency, is this currency is going to be deposited in the national banks. And no matter the situation with this or that bank, this money is going to be yours. And if this bank bankrupts, it doesn't matter that you're going to lose all your money, because you're not going, because your money are deposited on the digital currency in the central bank. So the revolution is going in finance. It's coming, sorry. So this is the topics that they were discussing, I believe so.
I'm sure you're right. Can I just say, Dima, listening to you, I wonder whether we're heading towards a multipolar world, which I still believe and hope, or whether instead we're looking at the battle lines being drawn for the next conflict, the next global conflict. It seems to me it could go either way. It's all rather disturbing in some fashions. But I wanted to just thank you for coming on our program and sharing our thoughts. Now, if you could stay there, I'm going to pass on to Alex. I'm sure he's got things to ask and perhaps questions to put to you
Of
from our
course.
viewers.
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, you want to do about 15 to 20 minutes of questions? Is that all right?
Yes,
Alexander,
it's all right.
Dima? Yeah. Okay,
Yes.
let's start with Elena right there on the screen. Why don't Russia throw the UK ambassador out from Russia because of this uranium news?
Well, can I just say, speaking as a British person, I'm very much afraid that we're moving in exactly that direction. I mean, as I understand it, diplomatic contacts between Britain and Russia have essentially collapsed. I think the Russians probably don't want to see their ambassador thrown out of Britain. At least that's been the position up to now. But I wonder whether, from a Russian point of view, after an event of such hostility, that restraint will continue. I suspect that at some point we might even come to something like that. I don't know what Dima has any thoughts on this.
The first thought that came to my mind is it's just not polite from the Russian side. When after I listened to Alexander, I developed my idea and my thoughts. And the first thing, why the Russians haven't thrown the ambassador of Britain from Moscow is the same. We have the same answer to the question as why the Russians still haven't make any warranty to arrest Joe Biden. It's the same answer. Why the Russia still haven't announced about starting attack in Ukraine with the uranium ammunition or something like this. Why it's the question? The answer is the same. Why the Russians still haven't made any sanctions against the entire world, like Europe, and no matter the Nord Stream was destroyed, the Russians continue supporting Europe with gas and oil through the territory of Ukraine. So there is no answer. You need to feel the answer. You need to feel the Russian soul to understand that all these events, all these things in the past that I just described is the answer to this question why the Russians haven't thrown the ambassador of Britain from Moscow. It's not polite.
Commander Crossfire says, I really hope Russia liberates the whole of Ukraine for the sake of the Ukrainian people and humanity, but I fear they will not.
It's a question? Or it's
well, it's a comment and a question, but I fear they will not. I think that's the
Ukrainians themselves not being brainwashed before this brainwashing. Maybe there are still a lot of people. There are very good people. There are very kind people. Just take a look at the situation. How do they love their country? Could you tell me any other country in the world who loves their own country so much? I haven't seen even a single Ukrainian who was telling bad things about Ukraine. They love their country. They love their freedom. They love their everything they do, they love. This is a very beautiful nation. This is a very beautiful people. But at some certain point of history, a lot of people from this country were brainwashed. And as a result, these people were supported by the Western countries and they managed to take their power in their hands. And now we see the result of this situation. There are a lot of people who doesn't want this war. There are a lot of people who wants to continue this war. There are a lot of people who doesn't understand what is going on at all, and they completely lost themselves. I think that sooner or later, the people, the nation of Ukraine will understand what they want. What do they want? They will understand, and every single time since the beginning of this nation, these people were solving all their problems just one way: Maidan. And I believe that sooner or later we're going to see another Maidan. But this is going to be not Maidan against another military coup or something like this. Tired people will come to street and they will tell, stop war. And believe me, the next day this war is going to be stopped.
All right. From Angry Warhawk, if NATO is dissolved, what will happen in Europe?
If NATO was, sorry, what was?
Dissolved. Broken up. Yeah. Broken apart.
To tell the truth, nothing is going to happen. NATO, people in the Western country believes that the Russians sleep and see how to conquer the entire world. This is not true. they don't care about this situation. The people in Russia, they don't care about how people lives in Poland, in France. The only thing they care is whether they are able to get their oil dollars and to spend in France, in Paris, in London. But now they can do this, and this is the only problem. If there were no NATO, and what else? There is no anti-NATO from the Russian side. And do we see that the Russia collapses or the allies of Russia? No. These countries continue their survivance in the world without any block. So I don't see any problems without absence of NATO on the territory of Europe.
All right, from Marcus, will Poland enter this, and will Russia if they will Russia if they take the West? Part 2, will Russia one day seek revenge on Britain's navy for their role in assisting Ukraine to sink their flagship?
The only thing I know that people tell us about the Russians, that the Russians are always comes for their money. And it's about the question about the United Kingdom and the Britain. Anyway, no matter the situation in Ukraine, the Russians will come for their money, for their investments and so on, and they will force to pay them back everything till the last dollar. When talking about Poland, you know that Poland ambassador in France told us that if Ukrainians loses the war, they will be forced to join. But later, the Poland authorities said that we're not agree with the words of this ambassador, so nothing like that. But I think that if Ukrainians loses, and if the Russians continue their offensive operation, and if the Russians are able to cross Dnipro River and to get deeper inside the central part of Ukraine, there is a very high chances that Poland, or at least some ally group in the head of Poland, will be forced to cross the border and to create some buffer. There are very high chances of that, very high chances.
Sigrid says, Dima, thank you for all the info. Do you think it's possible a dirty bomb is tried in Belarus? How would Russia react?
No, I don't think so. You mean that Ukrainians can use dirty bomb on the territory of Belarus?
Belarus. Yeah.
I don't think so. You know that nobody wants the escalation of the conflict. Neither the NATO countries or everybody wants this conflict to be between Ukraine and Russia. Nobody wants spreading this conflict on the other territories of other countries. Nobody wants the Belarus forces started their offensive operation from Belarus to Ukraine. Furthermore, as I told you in the beginning, a few minutes ago, during the previous months, I was forced to change few banks to find the bank where I able to receive a Western currency. And this is also a benefit for Belarus for not entering this conflict. And I believe that a lot of Russian people uses the Belarus banks for the same purposes. So I don't think that anybody wants to lose the current structure. This is not a perfect structure, but it works, it's stable, and at least people can survive and people can cooperate and work together even during this special operation, during this war.
All right. Ignaki says, Western banking interests are also represented in this conflict. Agricultural land investments, munitions, telecommunications are just a few. How can Ukraine approach a peace agreement in light of its Western indebtedness?
Very difficult. I don't think that the Russians will allow to save aggressive Ukraine. So anyway, the most important thing that the Russians will try to force during upcoming peaceful agreement, peaceful negotiation, is peaceful Ukraine on the border with Russia. And the most important, if it's possible, the Russian, let's say, a person as a president of Ukraine, Russian speaking, who supports Russia, or at least who doesn't have problems with the Russians. But I don't think that it is possible to have aggressive president in the head of Ukraine as a part of peaceful agreements. It's impossible, I believe. So Russia are not going to go for this, because they, as we see, this is the consequences of such aggressive president in the past in Ukraine. I'm talking about Poroshenko, who started his war even without being adopted as a president of Ukraine. and the Russians are not going to go for this one more time. They need a peaceful president, and for them, it's the best if this president talks Russian.
Yeah. John Ashley Smith says, what about the construction of a rumored 3 new army corps in Western Ukraine?
These, yes, there are a lot of, as you know, maybe you don't, that these days the Western countries trains around 75,000 soldiers. Yes, this is a very short-term trainings courses, like 5 weeks, but you don't need to think that Ukrainians take people from the street and then they're sending them, let's say, to Britain or to Poland for trainings. No, of course not. First, they teach these soldiers on the territory of Ukraine for a few months, and then they're sending them like a final step to train them in the Western countries to work with the Western weapon that the Western countries are going to provide Ukraine for the next upcoming counteroffensive operation. So these 3 course is it true? It's not a fake. The Ukrainians continue preparation of this powerful army, but I don't know whether this army is already on the territory of Ukraine, or maybe this army is still abroad on some training schools, training centers of the Western countries. But as soon as they will be redeployed back, the Ukrainians will use them in Zaporozhye and maybe any other front lines as well. So it's real information.
Okay, from level 42, how much losses can the Ukrainian forces afford before they start crumbling?
Some sources are saying, at least the Ukrainians are saying, that they have army bigger than more than 1 million soldiers. More than 1 million soldiers, not just about the soldiers that currently located on the front lines. I'm talking about the police, about all military forces. So million. And there are a lot of calculations, lots of talks from the Western countries, from the Russian countries. Everybody are trying to calculate the Ukrainian losses. For example, Ursula von Leyen told us in November that Ukraine lost around 100,000 soldiers killed. During a few weeks ago, the state's military authorities report about 120,000 soldiers killed. So as you can see, furthermore, the Russian sources are saying almost the same number, 100,000 killed. Of course, there are a lot of wounded, and usually the ratio between killed and wounded is around 1-3 or 1-4. Of course, but there are also, when we're talking about wounded, it doesn't mean that these guys who are wounded are out of game. Sometimes Ukrainians are able to return them back to the front lines. So as you can see, if we compare the loss of Ukrainians since the beginning of the special operation, they lost like less than 10% of their army they have right now. So you know that if we talk about the Second World War, the USSR lost 25 million people. So we can say that furthermore, some Western sources are saying that the Ukrainians, since the beginning of the special operation, have already lost 3 armies. So they have the army at the beginning of this conflict. This army was destroyed. Then they have another army that they managed to collect, make some mobilization. This army was defeated in Lysychansk, Mariupol, Severodonetsk agglomeration. And now another 3rd army have been defeated, and now the Ukrainians created another army. So I don't think that they have reserves for more than few millions people. The population of Ukraine was before the war around 40 millions. A lot of people left Ukraine after the beginning of the special operation, but I believe that they are able to mobilize up to 5 millions easily, because they are mobilized people from 18 till 65 years. It's a lot of people, believe me. So I don't think that losses is the factor that can start collapsing the Ukrainian army at all. I don't think so. As the Russians are saying, they need 3 weeks or maybe a few months after the Western countries stop supply Ukraine with the weapon, and this conflict will be ended. So the question is not about the loss among the manpower. The question is always about the supply and support of the Ukrainian army with the weapon and money.
What will happen to Galicia and Carpathia?
It depends whether the Russians are able to get there or not. So if the Russians are able to, let's say, to cross Dnipro River, maybe some of these territories will be taken by Hungary, by Poland, as soon as they see that there is no need to support and to keep Ukraine anymore, and there is a very big chance to split this territory one more time, as we used to see the same in the 18th century with Poland. They will do this, but I don't think that we are going to see such a big escalation. I believe that at some certain point of time, they will start negotiation and the countries will save Ukraine with some territory losses. I'm talking about DPR, LPR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. I don't think that Ukrainians are able to return these territories back, but I think that Ukraine as a country will be saved and will continue existence on the map of Europe and the map of world for centuries and maybe thousands of years till the end of the world. Maybe I'm not talking about the power and the authorities. I think that there are going to be some changing process, and some authorities will be changed by people who maybe more support Russians than the Western countries, but Ukraine will survive. I believe so.
All right, from Elena, Dima, how is the morale among civilians and military in Ukraine? Do you know? The same question about Russia.
When talking about Russia, people, the lives there haven't stopped. People continue their life, paying debts, paying credits, buying cars, and so on. Nothing changes. A lot of things changed for the families whose part of the family was sent to the military operation. But as we know, the Russians mobilized just 300,000 people before the during the special operation, and they used just 200,000 before. And so that's why not much changed in the people's life in Russia. About Ukraine, of course, I believe you saw a lot of videos of the new graves of Ukraine in almost every single town of Ukraine was increased by the squares that they were forced to give under the graves, thousands of graves. Of course, the life in Ukraine has been changed significantly because I believe that almost every single family lost or a member of their family, or at least a friend. I believe that there are no people in Ukraine who doesn't know anybody who was killed during the special operation. So of course their life have been changed. But even though they still also marry, they still have kids, they do have business. So life continue no matter the special operation.
Pirate Fish says, how much weaponry might NATO still add to this conflict? We hear how there is serious shortages, but wonder.
You know that who can tell you the truth about the real ammo and about ammo depot and shell depot, who has what and what has. For example, since during this year, this is very interesting numbers. For example, during this year, to prepare this greatest counteroffensive operation, for example, the Western countries promised to provide Ukraine 200 T-72 tanks from Czech Republic, I remember. Leopard 80 units, Leopard 1 88 units, Challenger or 14 or 28 units, Abrams 31 unit, but the states are saying that they will be able to send these tanks just the next year, and maybe Pakistan is going to send another 40 units of T-80. So we can calculate all these tanks, and we see that during this year, at least during this stage of the year, the Western countries are going to provide Ukraine around 400 or 500 tanks. And there was a very interesting piece of news I read in some Russian military expert channel that the Russians these days are able to produce around 30 tanks per day. I'm not saying so truth, it's very difficult to believe this number, but just imagine. I think that when he was talking about 30 tanks, I don't think he was talking about production from the ground, from zero. I think he was talking about modernization or fixing, but imagine yourself, 30 tanks per day. So the Western countries, to supply the Ukraine offensive operation in Zaporozhye, are going to send 500 tanks, and the Russians per 1 month are able to produce up to 1,000. So to tell the truth, very difficult to believe sometimes these numbers, but the numbers are saying for themselves, like as a facts as well.
From JetSet.1, Russia has entered as far as Dvorichna. Why?
So could you repeat the question?
Russia has entered as far as Dvorichna. Why? Dvorichna.
There are two Dvorichna on the special military operation, and both of these Dvorichnas are located in the Kupiansk area and Kupiansk front line. One is Dvorichna is located in Kharkiv area on the Ukrainian side of the river, and another one on the Russian side. And the Russians, if the question about these Dvorichna, the Russians, they need to secure the flanks, and one of the possible directions on that side of the front lines is to restore control over the railroad that connects Moscow and Bakhmut and Donetsk. And Dvorichna goes, and the railroad goes exactly through this town. So they need, furthermore, these two towns is splitted by the river Oskol. So they need to get this town for many reasons. One of them is to secure the flanks and to push the Ukrainians on the other side of the river. And another thing, they need to restore the railroad connection between Moscow and Donetsk. And this railroad goes exactly through this town.
Okay, let's do a couple more and we'll wrap it up. From Sparky, is it possible that Russia reabsorbs Ukraine? It was Russia until 1954. Then Russia won't need a puppet government since Ukraine will be Russia.
I don't think so. To tell the truth, no, they don't need this. Nobody needs, these days, nobody needs to conquer the countries as we used to see in the medieval period of time when we saw a lot of kingdoms were trying to conquer another kingdom and so on. Now we don't need this. Nobody needs this. The only thing the people need is the common bank system, common currency, and I think that, let's say, the president that speak the same language or something like this. If the Russians are able to establish control over these spheres of Ukrainian life, currency, bank system, finance, taxation, let's say, then they don't need to conquer Ukraine. They don't need to change the title of this country and so on. Today we have a lot of things how we can brainwash, how government can brainwash people brains, a lot of services, a lot of schools and so on. So it will, of course, it will take time, but I think that if the Russians are able to achieve these things in the 50 years, they will be able to do a situation when the Ukrainians will forget about the special operation and they will forget about the real reasons of this special operation. Furthermore, they will think that that was if the Russians, believe me, if the Russians are able to establish control of Ukraine over these parts of their life, believe me, in 50 years, somewhere at schools, they're going to be, let's say, exam for students, and the question will be the reasons of special military operation, and the books will say like the United States of America make military coup, and after that they're using the forces of Ukraine, the United States started to war against Russia, something like this. And Russia, because we know the winners writes the history. So I won't be surprised if in 50 years we're going to see something like this.
Yeah. From Ferenc, why don't the Russians cut the rail, air, and road connections to stop the Western military supplies? I get that question a lot.
As you know, the Russians started attacking Ukrainian energy facilities during the before the great retreat of the Russians or great regrouping from Kherson region. So it's the autumn of 2022. So somewhere in October, if correct me if I'm wrong, the Russians start using their missiles to attack the Ukrainian energy facilities. And today is the 21st of March, and we see that Ukrainians still have electricity, water, and imagine yourself, I'm not saying that the Russians can't like destroy the energy facilities and the power plants and so on. They are able to do this. But you see that they're not so effective even against the energy facilities. Yes, they're effective. They dealt a lot of damage. I believe that the Russians managed to achieve significant success, then they managed to help their forces on the ground. But when talking about the bridges that were built during the Soviet period of time, and believe me, during the Soviet period of time, they knew how to build like bridges and dams and so on. I don't think that it's an easy job to destroy a bridge. I remember that in the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians attacked the bridge that connect Odessa with, let's say, with the South Odessa region. There is a bridge, and as far as I remember, the Russians used at least 3 missiles to destroy the bridge. As a result of those attacks, yes, they managed to deal damage, but they didn't destroy the bridge. They just break some lines, and to tell the truth, I think it will take maybe a week for the Ukrainians to restore this bridge, and I won't be surprised that they have already done this. So from the economic perspective, this is not very useful usage of investments.
Yeah.
So you need millions or thousands of rockets for these purposes, or you don't need to do this at all. You need to find another solution how to cut the supplies from the Western countries.
From a different perspective, we include all U.S. personnel as our fighting force, reservists, cooks, etc. How do we match up against Russia reservists, Wagner?
To tell the truth, I don't have this information, and can't give you an answer to this question about Wagnerians. And to tell the truth, these days it's not a very good idea to talk a lot about the structure of Wagnerians, at least for people who located in Belarus and Russia, because according to the latest laws that were adopted on these territories, might be considered as a fake information. And that's why you can be punished for this heavily. So that's why I'm sorry that I can't answer you this question. This question is very interesting, but you need to understand me as well. I'm located on the territory of this country, so I don't want to risk.
Okay, let's do one more from Ricardo Afonso. If NATO can barely produce regular shells, how do they produce uranium shells?
They don't need to produce uranium shells. I believe they have stocks for these purposes, and to support one offensive operation. Another topic, to test the weapon. They will bring the number of such types of shells as much they need just for this certain offensive operation in Zaporozhye. They will test the weapon, they will see the result, and then they will take a decision whether they need to increase the production of these shells, or maybe they need to stop investments in this field, and that's it.
I saw a comment earlier asking, where is the ICC, The Hague, now that Britain's going to be using depleted uranium?
Yes, yes. Where are them?
Where are they?
Where indeed? Where are they?
Wasn't the collective? And wasn't the U.S. and the collective West telling us for a year that Russia's going to use a dirty bomb and Russia's going to use uranium and Russia's going to? At the end of the day, we get the UK providing the depleted uranium.
Yes, I'm very troubled. I'm very upset by this.
Here's what, and we'll leave it on this. And we'll leave it on this note. We'll wrap it up. Sparky says depleted uranium is very dense and heavy, so a small projectile can act as a large one. The legacy sickness is an unfortunate and horrible side effect.
Yeah, this is the disaster, and the most important that. As we discussed, there's a very high chances that we might see this weapon on our streets, not just in Ukraine, anywhere else.
Yeah. Dima, what do you think is going to happen to Odessa? The question on the screen right now.
I believe that Odessa in 100 years is going to be a very beautiful town, and I hope that everybody who this evening, this day, joined this great show will be able to visit Odessa, to see its beautiful places, to see Russian and Ukrainian flags together somewhere in the middle of the main street, and the NATO and US flag as well, and everybody is going to be happy. This is what I think is going to be with Odessa. It's a beautiful town, and I hope and I think that nothing bad is going to happen with this town, no matter who is going to control this town in the end.
That is a good way to end this live stream. Yeah. Dima from the Military Summary channel. I will have all of Dima's information in the description box down below, as well as a pinned comment. Alexander, Dima, any final thoughts before we sign out? Thank you to everyone that watched us on Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, the Duran.locals.com, and on YouTube and Telegram as well. And thank you to our moderators, Valies and Peter and William Justice and Spartan Warrior Queen and Zariel and Alan and Reckless Abandon. And am I missing anybody? I hope I am not. Did I say Peter? Yes, I said Peter. I hope I didn't miss any of the moderators. Thank you very much for helping us out. Dima, Alexander, any final thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Dima, and just to remind everybody to go to the Military Summary channel. Dima provides the most extraordinarily detailed, granular updates about what goes on in this military conflict. And I mean, we got a sense today of what a huge conflict this is and how many ramifications it has and how important it is. And can I also say that, Dima, I very much hope that we'll have you again on the Duran.
Of course. No, don't doubt. No, there's no even doubts about this. And I want to thank you guys for the platform you provide. You're the best platform ever. So it's the best opportunities for people, young people like me, and for other people who has their own opinion, and to share their opinion with the people. So I hope that everything is going to be fine. I wish you good luck. I wish you the best, everything I can to wish you. And thank you, guys.
And thank you, Spartan Warrior Queen, as well, for moderating. Thank you, everybody. Take care.